Welcome to Voices from Zion. Together, we'll explore the scriptures in their original Hebrew, wrestle with hard questions, and celebrate the beauty of what unites us, and the respect that deepens when we acknowledge what doesn't. So welcome to the dialogue, welcome to the wrestle, welcome to Voices from Zion. Robbie and the Rabbi.
Oh, it's going to be an amazing episode. We know because we recorded it once already, and we apologize that last week's episode was kind of came into the middle of what it is that we were talking about. And so today we get a chance to revisit that. And I know that you're going to enjoy this idea of how God is restoring the land of Israel and certainly its people in the process, and how wonderful it is that we get to be in the Bible, and see what God is doing with that. So with that said, I mean, I'm anxious to hear Isaiah again.
Okay, so really this theme of renewal, which of course, as you so well express it, is renewal of the people and renewal of the land, is ubiquitous in the Bible, and perhaps nowhere more so than in Isaiah. So just to rapid fire succession. Isaiah chapter 35, beginning with verse 1, the wilderness and the dry land shall be glad, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. Verse 7, and the parched land shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. In the habitation of jackals, herds shall lie down. It shall be a grassy place for reeds and rushes. And of course, there's just so much in the land of Israel that also aptly fulfills that vision. Places that were utterly desolate and become a grassy place for reeds and rushes. And we can continue. Isaiah chapter 41, beginning in verse 18, I will open rivers on the high hills and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry land springs of water. I will plant in the wilderness the cedar, the acacia tree, the myrtle, the oil tree. I will set in the desert the cypress, the plane tree, and the larch together, that they may see and know and consider and understand together that the hand of the Lord has done this, and the Holy One of Israel has created it. Because, of course, on the one hand, sure, there were the pioneers, the planters, the ones who came in their multitudes, and, well, the only land that they could get hold of, because that was the only land that was even leased at all to the Jews, was the most desolate parcels of land. For the absentee owners who lived in Lebanon, Syria, wherever, they weren't going to let the Jews have any of the choice lands in the land of Israel, so they gave them the most desolate parcels they had. And, of course, they gave their hearts and souls into planting up that land that they were able to acquire. It was not all desert. There were also the malarial swamps. And many of those Jewish pioneers gave their lives to malaria. That was an endemic and almost ubiquitous illness in the land of Israel at the time. But at the end of the day, while we certainly aren't in any way diminishing the self-sacrifice and dedication, as God expresses it, He's the one who's planting. He's got His messengers, or the way I like to express it, His junior partners. And the greatest gift is when God invites us to be His junior partners. But ultimately, God says, I'm the one who's planting. I plant in the wilderness. And again, this is something that we revisit over and over again in Isaiah chapter 44. And this is the statement in verse 24 of the Lord, your Redeemer, He that formed you from the womb. Verse 26, that confirms the word of His servant and completes the counsel of His messengers, that says of Jerusalem she shall be inhabited, and of the cities of Judah they shall be built, and I will raise up the waste places thereof. And again, of course, it's this theme of His servant, His messengers. They're the ones who serve as the means, but ultimately God is the one who is raising up the waste places thereof. And likewise, in Isaiah chapter 49, your waste and desolate places and the land that has been thrown down, destroyed, surely now will be too straight for the inhabitants. And again, the theme, who is the one who's doing it? Isaiah chapter 51, verse 3, the Lord has comforted Zion. He has comforted all her waste places and has made her wilderness like Eden and their desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness shall be found therein, thanksgiving and voice of melody. I don't want to overkill here, but there's still more passages from Isaiah. We're not even talking about the other prophets yet, but just to go through these passages in Isaiah. Of course, inevitably, as we continue further and further into Isaiah, the theme of consolation and God restoring what was lost becomes ever more dominant. In Isaiah chapter 54, verse 3, you shall spread abroad on the right hand and on the left, and your seed shall possess the nations and make the desolate cities to be inhabited. Isaiah chapter 55, verse 13, instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress, instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle, and it shall be to the Lord for a memorial, for an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. Isaiah chapter 58, verse 12, and they that shall see of you shall be, and they that shall be of you shall build the old waste places, and you shall raise up the foundations of many generations, and you shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in. And again, the promise in Isaiah chapter 60, verse 15, whereas you were called, forsaken, and hated, so that no man passed through you, I will make you into an eternal excellency, a joy of many generations. Chapter 61, verse 4, and they shall build the old wastes. They shall raise up the former desolations. They shall renew the waste cities, the desolations of many generations. And again, in much the same theme, in chapter 62, verse 4, you shall no more be termed forsaken, neither shall your land be termed desolate, because you shall be called, my desire is in her. Of course, that's God speaking first person. My desire is in her. And your land espoused, for the Lord desires you, and your land shall be espoused. And perhaps finally, the next to last chapter of Isaiah, chapter 65, from verse 21, they shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat the fruit of them. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For as the days of a tree shall be the days of my people, and my chosen shall outlive the work of their hands. They shall not labor in vain, nor bring forth for terror. For they are the seed blessed of the Lord, and their offspring with them. And it shall come to pass that before they call, I will answer, and while they are not yet speaking, I will hear. Just the antithesis of God being deaf to our cries. He hears us before we even know that we're calling.
Yeah, this is just, so much my mind is about to explode here, but I want I want to, at some point in time, but before I talk about what I saw in Israel, I also want to not forget to talk about how what I see is we, the people, not that we're the people of Israel, but the people of Israel are, in their own way, especially in the passages where he was talking about the water, that all of a sudden there's going to be pools of water, and all of a sudden there's going to be this water, and all of a sudden water. Well, Torah is water, right? And so fascinatingly, as the people, in other words, come back together and go deeper into Torah, they become those very fruitful, beautiful, amazing, that's all part of what he's picturing there too. But going back to the land, when I was in Israel back in May, They took us to what they said was the outermost or the southernmost outpost in the occupied territory of Palestine that's down in Judah. And so it's way down in Judah, and they drove us down there, and talk about desolate, would not begin to describe. I lived in New Mexico. I graduated from high school out there. I've been to White Sands. I've seen a lot of desert in my life. I kind of grew up in my own way in the desert. That ain't desert. You haven't seen desert until you see. And again, I haven't. All I know is that, man, when we were down there, like, really, we're going to a farm that can't possibly be a farm in the middle of, and it's somewhat mountainous, and honestly, we're hearing gunshots all over the place. This is how occupied this is. Like, they're literally, and at the time, of course, the war was, very much in going on.
Yeah.
And so we pull into this highly barbed wire kibbutz, which is a sort of a farm thing, right, for those who are not familiar with it. And I mean, there's barbed wire and guard posts and all this, and it's like, what? And then, we kind of go down this long dirt road. And as we get down there, all of a sudden, in the middle of like absolute nowhere desert, is this beautiful, lush, green field of and orchards and vineyards and all this stuff that's been planted right there. And then we come up there, and there's just like 2 or 3 Israel Defense Force people that are essentially occupying this and farming it. And they've only been there, a relatively short time. So to see that, I think they'd been there maybe 2 years, 3 years. To see what it is that they had going was absolutely mind-blowing. But the part that I will never forget was he said, they asked me to come out here because if we could get something going on the land, then we could begin to, reclaim it, however that would work. And so when I came out, I said, I'm not a farmer, and all it is rocks and sand, and like, there's nothing going to grow. They said, just put the seed in the ground, water it, watch what happens. And he goes, oh my gosh, what you're seeing right now is not based on any farming experience whatsoever, but the fact that God is restoring the land. And again, if you don't see God in that, I don't even know what to say. But as you described, and I don't want people to miss this, it broke my heart. It still breaks my heart what you told me about the original settlers in Europe had been forced into cities, and the fact that the original ones that came, they weren't farmers either.
Not at all, right? There's the Jews coming from Europe, that is, in the waves of the Jews that came from the Arab world, because, of course, they had to flee for their lives in the mid-20th century. The moment that the State of Israel was declared, they became persona non grata in areas in which they had been living for literally a millennium before Islam even existed. And some of them really did have experience in farming, but we're going back to the mid-19th century. The settlers who came primarily from Eastern Europe, primarily from the Russian Empire, because there was such virulent anti-Semitism there, they were all city dwellers because they had been forbidden to own land. And that was the case in much of Europe, most of Europe, that the Jews hadn't been allowed to own land. That, was, of course, was one of the major reasons that the Jews were the shopkeepers and the lenders and so on. They didn't have any experience in farming because they couldn't farm. And they come to the land of Israel. And of course, this was not merely by virtue of circumstance, this was by ideology, to coax sustenance from the Holy Land. And they had no experience. And truth of the matter is, the land didn't have any more experience than they, because the land hadn't been cultivated for close to 2 millennia either. And again, they were working on malarial swamps and deserts. That was pretty much it. If I can speak on a very personal note, I'm, of course, very much hoping that you, Pastor Avi, will be able to be our guest here in our neighborhood in Har Nof on the west end of Jerusalem. So I always describe where we are on the map, if you draw a line due west from the Temple Mount, then the last area it will pass through before plunging into Jerusalem Forest will be our neighborhood. We're right adjacent to the Jerusalem Forest. And the Jerusalem Forest is this beautiful woodland area. And if you don't know its story, you might think, okay, yeah, another forest. Like there are so many forests in the world. The trees of the Jerusalem Forest were all planted by hand. There was no forest. There were some old growth forests that still existed in the Galilee. There were few, but there were some. But in this part of the country, there were none. There were no trees. Israel is the only part of the world in which the percentage of forestation increased over the last century because there were no forests. And I'm looking out my window and I see all these forested hills and mountains, and I know what went into producing them. Every one was planted by hand. Of course, now the trees are there, they regenerate, they drop seed, and new trees will grow, but that didn't happen for a long, long time. Unfortunately, there are still parts. I don't know if you've heard about the devastating forest fires that we've had this year as well. In other parts of the world, for example, in the US, you can have forest fires in dry spells because there could be a lightning bolt that ignites the dry ground. That's not the case here. There is no lightning during the summer. There is no rain at all. This is a Mediterranean climate. Those forest fires were deliberately set. Like people who still want to keep the Jews off of the land. So there's still areas that need to be replanted and regenerated. But thank God, there are forests, and they continue to flourish. Why? Because of God. Period. End of statement. Because of God. When we look out the window and see the forests, we are seeing prophecies fulfilled. We are seeing God's hand before our eyes.
That's amazing. It is. But if you don't mind, speak to your concept of how that is not just a physical reality, which it is, but it's a spiritual
Absolutely
reality as well, right?
So, of course, you mentioned before the beginning of Isaiah chapter 55. Anyone who thirsts, come you for water. And here that has no money, come you buy and eat, buy wine and milk without money and without price. And of course, this theme, which is manifestly redemptive, begins with those who are thirsting. Come for water. And the continuation, which is admittedly, there's no question here, this is also rebuke. The next verse, why do you spend money for that which is not bread, and your gain for that which does not satisfy? Hearken diligently unto me, and eat that which is good, and let your soul delight itself in the fatness thereof. So, of course, that's a spiritual message. That's spiritual sustenance. But, hey, the physical and the spiritual, they're not at loggerheads. They're two sides of one coin. That is, ultimately, the flourishing of the land is precisely a reflection of that. And I have to share with you, I was reminiscing to some of our grandchildren a week ago of one of the songs of the pioneers. This is a song that goes back to the 19th century. But, our grandchildren are so far away that they didn't know the song. So I was sharing with them the song, and the theme, just sharing with you this stanza. It's Hebrew, but of course, it's not from the Bible. It's from just a century ago. Here in the land that our forefathers longed for, all of our hopes will be actualized. Here we will live, and here we will form lives of radiance and lives of liberty. And the next two lines, this is a pioneer song. Here God's presence will indwell. Here will flourish again the language of the Torah. Hebrew, because Hebrew also needed to be renewed. That is, Hebrew was, for all of the period of exile, the language of study, the language of scholarship. Yeah, we've shared, I'm always a little bit out of kilter in using translations because there was never a tradition among the Jews to study the Bible in any language other than the original. But it still was the language of study, the language of scholarship. It wasn't the language of going to the grocery store. That also needed to be reborn, to be resuscitated. But again, this theme, and it's concomitant. Here God's presence will indwell. Here,
you feel like that, again, we have no sense of, because it, I don't know of a single Christian church that they don't speak whatever the native language of the people is, and then they use numerous translations. Unfortunately, most of them Greek translations of Hebrew, which is just it just blows my mind at times to think, because I can't tell you the errors that I've seen over the years. Like, how did they come up with this? This is crazy. Just total misunderstandings of words, and apparently, from what I understand, grace, the word grace, like Noah found favor in God's eyes, like that's a huge concept.
Yes,
and it's a lot different than mercy, right? It's a hugely different spelling and idea,
sure,
all sorts of things. But unfortunately, when you look at, here's a rendering where the Apostle Paul quotes Moses, quotes Exodus, where God is speaking of himself, saying that he is, you could quote it exactly, but essentially he's saying that I will be gracious to who I will be gracious to.
Yes.
Right? And he uses the word grace.
Right. You
will find that in fact, in every single English translation that I could find, put my hands on, they translated the word to mercy. I will be merciful to whom I will be merciful to.
Well, so the truth is, so in that expression, this is a fascinating discussion in of itself, because what God is saying, just to give the exact verse, we're speaking of Exodus chapter 33, verse 19. In the Hebrew, "V'chanoti et asher achon v'richamti et asher arachem." I will grace whomever I shall grace, and I will give compassion to whomever I shall give compassion. So there is arguably that theme of mercy, compassion. I'm not exactly sure what the difference between mercy and compassion is in English either, but that is a term that does refer to God's mercy. I would say what is specific to the word that we are translating as grace, and it's the same word, of course, in Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, that's chen. And chen is linguistically related to chinam, which means gratis. And it's important to appreciate the distinction here, because there is the aspect of compassion, but there's also this dimension of God being free giving. It is in the self-same vein, just a few verses afterward, in Exodus chapter 34, in verse 6, when God reveals to Moses what we describe in our tradition as the 13 attributes of divine mercy. That immediately after the opening words, which are divine names, the Tetragrammaton appears twice, followed by El, which is also a word that refers to God as the source of power. The next two words are Rachum v'Chanun. Rachum, from the same root as the second verb that we noted in chapter 33, verse 19, being compassionate. And Chanun, likewise related to chen, the word that we rendered as grace. So in that vein, typically we would translate Rachum as compassionate or merciful. And
let me
sure,
just to clarify, so because I'm sure a lot of Christian listeners are like, Robbie, why don't you quote what Paul said? So I'll quote what Paul said in Romans chapter 9, verse 15, the way it's translated. But you know that Paul was obviously a Hebrew scholar. I mean,
he was thinking in
he
Hebrew,
would not
of
have
course.
misquoted Moses, not to this extent, okay? And so what it says in Romans 9:15, it says, for he said to Moses, and this is the King James Version, but you'll find it across most translations will be some version of this. For he said to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So they got compassion right.
But the grace is missing.
But grace is missing, which is absolutely huge. It's absolutely huge.
It's bizarre. Why did they leave that out?
Yeah.
I was like, you almost feel compelled to ask, was there some kind of bizarre agenda?
Right. Well, especially when you think of this, and here's something that in Greek you may know that grace is generally translated charis or har. I don't know how you necessarily say it in Greek, but it's charis. Okay, and in our fundamental belief about Jesus in John chapter 1, it says that Jesus was full of grace and truth. So all of us that believe in Christ, the grace aspect of it is gigantic. It's huge. It's like, oh my gosh, this is a huge thing, Charles. However, if you study the New Testament, and it's very difficult, like as much as you study it, you will find that Jesus only teaches on the word charis twice. However, if what Paul says is mercy is grace, then all of a sudden Jesus taught on it a ton. Because there's so much that, in other words, that little translation difference, and again, which speaks to the point that I really want to get to, which is if we truly understood God's word in Hebrew, and Christians, Jews, whoever, this is what he wrote. In other words, God is describing himself in this passage. I mean, how more important a passage can you get than God is speaking to a man and saying, this is who I am. I'm going to show mercy. I'm going to be gracious to who I just think that's a gigantically huge understanding. And we need to, if we're going to really push into who God is, we need to know what he actually said conceptually. And how do you do that if you're using a language, which I understand because I spent a lot of time on this and asking artificial intelligence, et cetera, how in the world it happened. Essentially what they told me was that Greek doesn't have enough verbs to be able to fill out what the Hebrew said. It's like in English, we don't have but one word for love, which is horrible because you can love, a hot dog, you can love a person, whatever, it's just, where in Greek, obviously you have 2 or 3 words, agape, and all these different words for love. In Hebrew, oh my gosh, the words for love, right? And they each have a completely different concept within there. And so here's this unbelievably rich language that God gave us, from my perspective, unbelievably rich, because it's a picture language and a lot of other things. And it's been diluted by Greek, and then diluted by Latin, and then really diluted by English. So, and again, this is Robbie's opinion, but nonetheless, if we could all speak God's language, if you don't think that's Hebrew, whatever it is that you think, it would be nice. I'm sorry to go on, but I'm
No,
just.
I completely agree. And of course, this is inevitably the idea that always surges into my mind in Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9. Then I will change to a pure language for all peoples, to call all of them in the name of the Lord, to serve him shoulder to shoulder. Or, of course, as our friend Pastor Mark expresses it, and he's right, that the Hebrew says shechem echad, which means one shoulder, as if we become conjoined twins, conjoined at the shoulder. And of course, that is fundamentally, most critically, because we're calling together in the name of the Lord. But it's also because we have that pure language. And the pure language, obviously, in the ideal is Hebrew. So I always emphasize, and I really do mean this in utmost sincerity, that I do feel we experience at least a partial fulfillment of that prophecy just coming together in God's word. And I always feel this so acutely when I'm speaking to a Christian audience, quoting God's will revealed in his word from Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible, and they're hearing it the same way. And I know they're hearing it the same way. And that's a profoundly powerful platform upon which we stand together. But it would still be easier if we could do it in Hebrew. And when you consider the nuances of Hebrew, if I can just share one almost pedestrian observation. I don't think it's so pedestrian, however. We're familiar with the verb in English, have. In French, avoir. I'm not familiar with other languages to be able to testify to how it is expressed in other languages, but I have something. Being possessive. What's the possessive verb to have in Hebrew? It's a trick question. The answer is it doesn't exist. The way in Hebrew I would say I have something. Let's say I have a book. Yesh li sefer, which literally means there exists for me a book. That's the only way you could say I have. There exists for me. But there's no verb for to have. And maybe that's significant because perhaps Western languages gauge people in terms of what they have. And Hebrew, well, phonetically, there is a verb that sounds a lot like have or avoir. It is the verb hoveh. But it's the verb of being. That's not about having it, that's about being. It's about who you are, not what you have. A little bit of Hebraic linguistic perspective.
That's huge. That is I'll have to ponder that one for weeks. Like, how awesome is that? Because in the honest, we're stewards of whatever it is that God has given us, right? And there exists for me. I love that. I love that. There exists for me a wife. There exists for me a family. There exists for me certainly Torah to study and friends like you. Honestly, like
that word you just used, steward. That's such a beautiful way of expressing it. It's stewardship. That is, we don't actually acquire. We are stewards over whatever God has sent our way for us to do with it what we're supposed to. I always stress in this regard, and I realize that it may ruffle some feathers, but the land of Israel doesn't belong to us. In the Bible, I repeatedly encounter artzi, God saying, my land. And he's always referring to this one. So who does the land of Israel belong to? Of course, everything belongs to God. But God stresses the point, in particular with the land of Israel. He doesn't refer to any other parcel of real estate as artzi, as my land. Well, this one he does constantly. And maybe that's also a message to those who try to subvert or ignore that. I realize something that's, I guess, coming up in current events. Actually, it was our mutual friend, Pastor Mark, who pointed out to me that the vote in the UN over declaring statehood over a country that doesn't have borders or any of the other trappings of nationhood, and only putatively came into existence in the 1960s because some brilliantly evil geniuses realized it would be great to concoct a supposed nation that never existed and call them Palestinians as means for accusing the Jews somehow of being imperialists. I think it's probably the only nation in the history of the world whose supposed name they can't even pronounce. That is, in Arabic, there is no P sound. It comes out sounding like a B. So how do you have a name that starts out with a P sound? That was the word. So they've lately made it into an F, but that wasn't the word. Palestine was an innovation, you could best say a fabrication, of the Romans after they conquered this land, that they wanted to erase the Jewish connection by dredging up from forgotten history the Philistines.
Right.
And in Latin, calling the land Palestina in order to perpetuate a nation that had not existed at the time that the name was fabricated for a full millennium. And then you went another 2 millennia and fabricate something new. But in any case, my point simply with respect to the significance of declaring statehood for Palestine, apropos of God referring to just one land as Artzi, is the very well-known words of Joel. Whether we call this chapter 3, verse 2, or chapter 4, verse 2, I think depends upon the Bible. It's the same verse, and it's the same place in Joel, just whether the previous chapter is subdivided or not is the question. But in any case, the verse very tellingly, I will gather all nations and bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is simply Hebrew for God will judge. And I will enter into judgment with them there for my people and my heritage, Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and my land that they partitioned. My land. It wasn't their land. It was my land. So, when God says, this land is mine, obviously that's a message for everyone. It's a message for us too, for Israel in the land. And we always need to remember as well that this is God's land, but so does everyone else.
That's a spectacular understanding. And it's a spectacular thing that would probably be a good transition back to how we left ourselves on the end of a cliff on what we actually were able to record on the idea that it's a good thing that God is angry with us. And you were connecting that to pruning.
Yes, absolutely. So I hope we can at least we may need to leave this somewhat dangling because I'm afraid we'll run out of time. But let's at least give an attempt at starting on this. Of course, what you just referenced is the words of Isaiah chapter 12, verse 1. In that day you will say, I will give thanks unto you, O Lord, because you were angry with me. When your anger is turned away, you comfort me. Possibly the last phrase should be better translated. A supplication, may your anger be turned away and may you comfort me. But I give thanks because you were angry with me. And in order to be able to appreciate what the significance of that verse is, we really need to take it in context. That is, inevitably, of course, Isaiah chapter 12, verse 1 is coming on the heels of chapter 11. What's going on in chapter 11? In chapter 11, of course, the chapter begins, as everyone knows very well, with there shall go forth a shoot out of the stock of Jesse, and a twig shall grow forth out of his roots, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And he shall be animated by fear of the Lord, and shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears. Now, this gets a little bit complicated, because if we ask, who is he? Who is the one being described in these verses? So the truth of the matter is that I think virtually all Jews and Christians will respond identically. This is talking about the Messiah.
Right.
And on the one hand, that certainly is a valid answer. Yeah, but, inevitably in the words of the Bible, there are multiple strata. And in order for us to really understand what's going on at the beginning of chapter 11, we need to turn another couple of pages backward and ask ourselves what's taking place at the end of chapter 10. I'm not going to keep on going until we get to the chapter 1 here, but chapter 10 is critical in order for us to understand the context of chapter 11. And we'll just note the succession of verses in chapter 10, in particular, what is described from verse 28 through the end of the chapter. There's also a he here who needs to be identified. He has come to Ayat. He has passed through Migron at Michmas. He lays up his baggage. They are gone over the pass. They have taken up their lodging at Geba. Ramah trembles. Gibat Shaul is fled. Cry out with a shrill voice, O daughter of Galim. Hearken, O Laish. O poor Anatot. Madmena wanders. The inhabitants of Gevim flee. What's described here? Verse 32. This very day shall he stand at Nob, shaking his hand derisively at the mountain of the daughter of Zion, the hill of Jerusalem. Now, there's a historical answer to this question. This is not mere metaphor. This is something very exclusively concrete in the most excruciating of senses. Who is he? He is Sennacherib. Sennacherib entered the land of Israel from the north, as everyone always does, because of the Fertile Crescent. That's the side of the land of Israel that is most vulnerable. And he begins his southern march by destroying the kingdom of northern Israel and exiling its inhabitants. But he's not finished. He's on the march. And these verses describe his trajectory as he heads south, culminating in this very day. He will stand at Nob, overlooking Jerusalem. And then two more verses. Behold, the Lord of hosts, shall lop the boughs with a saw, and the high ones of stature shall be hewn down, and the lofty shall be humbled. And he shall cut down the thickets of the forest with iron, and Lebanon shall fall by a mighty one. So, what's being described here?
Well, obviously, that sounds like the fall of Sennacherib, right?
Absolutely. And of course, that's precisely what we're describing here. The fall of Sennacherib that is described in the Bible when we read. This is a theme that is in particular described in Isaiah chapter 37. That is in the wake of the pretentious boastings of Rav Shakeh, the representative,
Right.
the taunter whom Sennacherib sends to tell the Jews who are defending Jerusalem that their situation is absolutely hopeless, and he elaborates with really blasphemous taunts against God. And King Hezekiah goes into the temple.
Lays out the letter, yeah.
He prays, he spreads out the letter, and he prays to God. And God sends Isaiah to reassure him. The words of Isaiah begin in chapter 37, verse 22. This is the word which the Lord has spoken concerning him. The virgin daughter of Zion has despised you and laughed you to scorn. The daughter of Jerusalem has shaken her head at you. Who have you taunted and blasphemed? And against whom have you exalted your voice? You have lifted up your eyes on high, even against the Holy One of Israel. By your servants you have taunted the Lord. And the ultimate consequences, as we read in the verses that follow, verse 29, because of your raging against me, and for that your uproar has come up into my ears, therefore will I put my hook in your nose and my bridle in your lips, and I will turn you back by the way by which you came. And there's a sign to the Jews in Jerusalem. This shall be the sign unto you. You shall eat this year that which grows of itself, and the second year that which springs of the same, and in the third year sow and reap and plant vineyards and eat the fruit thereof, and the remnant that is escaped of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem shall go forth a remnant, and out of Mount Zion they that shall escape. The zeal of the Lord of hosts shall perform this. And of course, the culmination in the verses that follow, therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into the city, nor shoot an arrow there, neither shall he come before it with shield, nor cast a mound against it. By the way that he came, by the same he shall return, and he shall not come unto this city, says the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. And the angel of the Lord went forth and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when men arose early in the morning, not those men, they were all dead corpses, and Jerusalem was saved. And of course, manifestly, that's precisely the theme of what we're reading at the end of chapter 11. Excuse me, at the end of chapter 10. So when we get to the beginning of chapter 11, and we read about the rejuvenation, there shall go forth a shoot out of the stock of Jesse, and a twig shall grow up forth out of his roots. To whom are we referring?
Sounds like Hezekiah.
Obviously Hezekiah. Now, of course, that doesn't in any way invalidate our appreciating of these verses also pertain to the Messiah, because the truth of the matter is, and we have a tradition as to why this is the case, these verses were not fully realized, fully actualized in King Hezekiah. And as a result, well, we read in Isaiah chapter 55 that as the rain and the snow go down from heaven and don't return there, but rather they moisten the earth and provide seed for the sower and bread for the eater. So shall be my word that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty-handed, but shall succeed in that for which I have sent it, and fulfill that for which it is given. So we appreciate very well that the word of God never goes back empty-handed, and we believe that the full, complete actualization of these words will indeed be in the coming of the Messiah.
And even further, I think, again, that leads to some very, in fact, I've often taught, both on my radio show and as a pastor, that to me, Isaiah 11 is such sacred ground. Because here we see this, what is described by many, and certainly by the Apostle John in the book of Revelation, the seven spirits of God. And you may know this, that in the book of Revelation, when they go into when John gets to see the temple, one of the first things he describes is the menorah, and which he says, and there's seven blazing torches, which are the seven spirits of God, which is cross-referenced by most Bibles back to Isaiah 11. And so I'm very curious if there's any tradition on your side that says that these seven attributes, which I describe differently than anybody I know, and so you can even tell me why you think I'm wrong on this too, because I probably am, but nonetheless, this is my take on it. This is wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, fear of the Lord, and in my opinion, what you said, animated, what I would say, delight in the fear of the Lord. It's almost like, from my perspective, my dad is so big and so amazing, and so I really, at my core, shouldn't worry about anything, because if he loves me, then why should I have any concern? That's a delight in the fear of the Lord. In other words, you go up to that level and it's like boom. And so, in my mind's eye, when I picture the menorah, I picture these, and again, based on, our tradition, I picture that, like, man, here are these seven blazing torches, and that center one being like, if I can get to that point of a delight in the fear of the Lord. Now you can say, Robbie, you're crazy.
I know. I think it certainly is. Of course, what I'll stress, and I think you're saying this also, is that these are not spirits of God, but spirits of the godly man who is imbued with these. That is, ultimately, this is in full an actualization of the Spirit of the Lord resting upon him through what follows. So we're not speaking of something that characterizes God, but characterizes God's summons of us. And of course, his promise, to the extent that we actualize the mission that God gives us. So on some level, this is indeed a blessing that we strive to actualize in our own lives. If I may place this in a quasi-liturgical framework, this verse we use in blessing every bridegroom.
Really?
On his way to the marriage canopy.
Really?
And as again, the theme that this is something that ultimately God is bestowing upon us, and through it, godly man is indeed animated by God's Spirit. So I don't know that would necessarily in any way diverge from what you said.
No, I don't know that. No, that's absolutely wonderful, and it brings up another one of my favorite, and I think it's in Jeremiah 29. Again, you know these things so much better than I do, and I'm so grateful for that. But it says that the Lord's going to do a new thing. The bride encircles the groom.
Well, that's also something that we
right.
We express in the marriage canopy. Onto the marriage canopy, there is a well-ensconced tradition. It's not like it's a biblical law or anything like that, but it's a very ancient custom that the bride circles the bridegroom in fulfillment of those words of Jeremiah. But of course, the simple meaning in the context of Jeremiah is that on some level, we describe our relationship with God as being God's bride.
Right.
And the normal routine is generally that the groom is suiting the bride, and of course that finds its expression at Sinai, when God, as it were, is beckoning us. But in the future, this is part and parcel with what we read in Jeremiah chapter 31 about God inscribing his word upon our hearts, that we'll be looking for God, seeking out God, which unfortunately in this world all too often we have not.
Yeah, I've seen that so beautifully. And I heard one teaching on it, that the reason that they go around 7 times is that they went around Jericho 7 times in order to bring down walls, and that the groom has walls around his heart, and the bride is to, she's illustrating a concept that she wants to create such a trust with the groom that he can begin to let his walls down. And in doing that, I have taught and loved the idea of, okay, how am I encircling God? How am I trying to invoke such trust in a relationship that he can begin to let me in? And by that, I mean, like, from my perspective, he let me into this conversation that, I met you in Israel, a blessing beyond blessing for me at this point in time. And to some extent, he's letting me in, right? He's letting me in as he trusts you more with his word. Don't you feel that he lets you into things that obviously are near and dear to his heart?
Every time I feel a new insight in God's word, that means that God is, as it were, inviting us in to his secrets.
Right. So obviously the wedding ceremony is an amazing picture of what God did at Sinai, like you said, of what he wants our relationship to be, and as we pursue that, it's like you said, that's a wonderful place. Like, man, the more the better. I hate we once again we've gone about as far around Robin, but I love it. We will get back to. We will not continue to hang you on the cliff of God's anger. However, it's a beautiful thing, and I hope, I really do pray that you have enjoyed this conversation nearly as much as I have, and I'm sure Rabbi Haim as well.
Oh boy, and of course, just to make sure we don't lose sight of the cliff, that is, this was all a lead up to going back to, I thank you, God, for you were angry with me, and how that's going to lead us into the song of the redemption, verse 2, and God's pruning and the redemptive moment. So we're still going to leave that dangling, I realize.
Yeah, but it's, to some way, that since we're speaking of the bride and we have it, just
sure.
Don't I want my wife to be angry with me if I am not doing what I ought to be, so that she can correct me, so that I can be the husband I need to be? By the same token, if I am God's bride, then don't I want him to tell me, Robbie, you are off, like, if you love somebody, you discipline them, right? And therein lies part of the deal, I imagine, right?
Well, but it may not even be solely in terms of disciplining. It may be also in terms of a divine scheme that we only catch a glimpse of in retrospect.
Oh, good. Now we're back on the cliff, just where we need to be. We will revisit it. And shalom, my dear friend.
Shalom, shalom. And when you mention the wedding canopy, some people might be thinking, isn't it almost blasphemous to be incorporating these motifs into the wedding ceremony when it's about our marriage to God? And of course, our response is, on the contrary. It's not bringing God and our relationship with him down. It's bringing our relationship with our spouse. And altogether, the way we need to be functioning individually and as a family and as a community, up, all as reflections of our getting our lives in order with God.
Yes, and I have had the absolute privilege and honor of meeting your wife and seeing your relationship in action and teaching together, and the joy that I see of what God can have in that as well. And I imagine that you've been married for some time, as I have, and
Yes.
It's a beautiful thing. Well, once again, shalom, my friend. God bless.
Shalom. God bless you. We look forward to continuing. Shalom to everyone listening in.
We are so honored that you would join us today on Voices from Zion, Robbie and the Rabbi. For more information about Rabbi Haim, go to his website, zionbiblestudies.org. That's zionbiblestudies.org. Or visit me, Robbie Dilmore, at the Christian Car Guy website. That's christiancarguy.com. Once again,
Shalom from Jerusalem, the holy city, God's city.